Hey guys, welcome back from spring break. I hope you all had a good week off and got a little relaxation in. I know that we've been kind of going a little bit crazy here ourselves on this quarantine, but I've been trying to get out as much as I can, even though it's been cold, and reading definitely helps. Reading is an escape. When we left off, guys, reading Holes, we were just about to start chapter 39, and we're getting to the end of this book. When we left off, Zero was getting carried up the mountain by Stanley. They were almost to the top of Big Thumb. So Stanley awoke in a meadow, looking up at a giant rock, at the giant rock tower. It was layered with and streaked with different shades of red, burnt orange, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like the insides of his mouth and his throat were coated with sand, and no wonder when he rolled over, he saw the water hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide. At the bottom lay no more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hands and his fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped some dirty water into his mouth and then swished it around, trying to filter it with his teeth. Zero moaned. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth, and he had to try again. "How you doing?" "It hurt to talk." "Not good," Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over and he raised himself up to his knees, and he crawled to the water hole. He lowered his head into it, and he lapped up some water. And then he jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and he rolled to his side. His body shook violently. Stanley thought about going back down the mountain to look for the shovel so he could make the water hole deeper. Maybe that would give them cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't think he had the strength to go down, let alone to make it back up again, and he didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around Big Thumb. He took a deep breath, and then he walked the last 50 yards. I don't know if you can see, this is my puppy. She came to say hi. Say hi. Sorry, guys. Good girl. Go lay down. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to extend all the way around Big Thumb. He took a deep breath, and then he walked the last 50 yards to the giant precipice, and he touched it. "Tag, you're it." Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked one of the flowers. It actually wasn't one big flower, he discovered, but instead, each flower was really a cluster of little tiny flowers that formed a round ball. He brought it to his mouth, but he had to spit it out. He could see a part of the trail that he had made the night before when he had carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down and look for the shovel, he realized he should do it soon while the trail was fresh, but he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid that Zero might die while he was gone. Zero was still lying, doubled over on his side. "I gotta tell you something," he said with a groan. "Don't talk," Stanley said. "Save your strength." "No. Listen," Zero insisted, and then he closed his eyes and his face twisted with pain. "I'm listening," Stanley whispered. "I took your shoes," Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. "That's all right," he said. "Just rest now." "It's all my fault," said Zero. "It's nobody's fault," said Stanley. "I didn't know," Zero said. "That's okay," Stanley said. "Just rest." Zero closed his eyes, but then again he said, "I didn't know about the shoes." "What shoes?" "From the shelter." It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. Clyde Livingston's shoes? "I'm sorry," said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confession seemed to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed, and he drifted into sleep. Stanley softly sang him the song that had been in his family for generations. If only, the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer. While the wolf waits below hungry and lonely, he cries to the moon, if only, if only. All right, we're on chapter 40. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully. But now, as he sat gazing at Big Thumb and the meadow full of flowers, he couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined his fingers and he tried to rub out the pain, and then he bent down and he dug up another flower, this time pulling up the entire plant, including the root. "Onions, fresh, hot, sweet onions," Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down the main street. 8 cents a dozen. It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted a pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peach trees along its shore. Mrs. Gladys Tennyson was wearing just her nightgown and a robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Mrs. Tennyson was normally a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat, so it was quite surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping his mule and his cart. "Good morning, Mrs. Tennyson," he said. "How's little Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about an hour ago, thanks to you." "I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserve most of the credit." "Good Lord, yes," agreed Mrs. Tennyson, "but not Dr. Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach. Leeches, my word. He said that they would suck out the bad blood. Now you tell me, how could a leech know good blood from bad blood?" "I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic," said Mrs. Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way over to the cart. "Good morning, Gladys," said Hattie Parker. Don't you look lovely this morning?" Several other people snickered. "Good morning, Hattie," Mrs. Tennyson replied. "Does your husband know that you are parading about in your bedclothes?" Hattie asked. There were more snickers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I am dressed, thank you," said Mrs. Tennyson. "We both have been up all night and half of the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. It seems she ate some bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was the butcher. "It made my husband and me sick as well," said Mrs. Tennyson, "but it nearly killed little Becca, what with her being so young. But Sam saved her life." "It wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca's all right," Hattie said contritely. "I keep telling Jim he needs to wash his knives," said Mr. Pike, who owned the general store. Hattie Parker excused herself and then turned quickly and walked away. "Tell Becca that when she feels up to it to come by the store for a piece of candy," said Mr. Pike. "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Mrs. Tennyson bought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and she told him to keep the change. "I don't take charity," Sam told her, "but if you want to buy a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she would appreciate it." "All right then," said Mrs. Tennyson. Give me my change in onions." Sam gave Mrs. Tennyson an additional 3 onions, and she fed them one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them right out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept off and on for the next 2 days. They ate onions, all they wanted, and they splashed dirty water into their mouths. In the late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley tried to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovel. His efforts just seemed to stir up the mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak, but the sleep and the onions seemed to be doing him some good. Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, he didn't want to go for the shovel while Zero was asleep. He didn't want him to wake up and think that he had been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I'll go look for the shovel," Stanley said. "I'll wait here," Zero said feebly, as if he had any other choice. Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him a lot of good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail that he had made 2 days earlier. There were a few places where he wasn't sure that he was going the right way, but it took just a little bit of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a ways down the mountain, but he still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up towards the top of the mountain. He must have walked right past it, he thought. There was no way he could have carried Zero all the way up from here. Still, he headed downwards just in case. He came to a bare spot between two huge, large Sorry. He came to a bare spot between two large patches of weeds, and he sat down to rest. Now he had definitely gone too far, he decided. He was tired out from walking down the hill. It would have been impossible for him to have carried Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried somewhere in the weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look around in all directions. He saw a large indentation in the weeds a little bit farther down the mountain. It didn't seem likely that the shovel could be there, but he had already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and the sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and the sack might have rolled down the hill, but none of the jars were broken, except for the one which had broken earlier, and if they had rolled down a bit, it is doubtful that he would have found the sack and the shovel side by side. On his way back up the mountain, Stanley had to sit down and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. All right, guys, that's the end of chapter 40. We're going to read 41 and be done for the day. Zero's condition continued to improve. Stanley slowly peeled an onion. He liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was now almost as large as the holes that he had dug back in Camp Green Lake. It contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all himself. Zero had offered to help, but Stanley thought it better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in the water than it was in a dry lake. Stanley was surprised that he himself hadn't gotten sick, either from the sploosh, the dirty water, or from living on onions. He used to get sick quite a lot back at home. Both boys were barefoot. They had washed their socks. All their clothes were very dirty, but their socks were definitely the worst. They didn't dip their socks in the hole, afraid to contaminate the water. Instead, they filled the jars and they poured the water over their dirty socks. I didn't go to the homeless shelter very often, Zero said. Just if the weather was really bad, I'd have to find someone to pretend to be my mom. If I had just gone by myself, they would have asked me a bunch of questions. If they had found out that I didn't have a mom, they would have made me a ward of the state. What's a ward of the state? Zero smiled. I don't know, but I didn't like the sound of it. Stanley remembered Mr. Pendanski telling the warden that Zero was a ward of the state. He wondered if Zero knew that he had become one. I liked sleeping outside, said Zero. I used to pretend that I was a Cub Scout. I always wanted to be a Cub Scout. I would see them in the park in their blue uniforms. I was never a Cub Scout, said Stanley. I wasn't good at social stuff like that. Kids made fun of me because I was fat. I liked the blue uniforms, Zero said. Maybe I wouldn't have liked being a Cub Scout. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. My mom was once a Girl Scout, said Zero. I thought you said you didn't have a mother. Everybody has to have a mother. Well, yeah, I know that. She said she once won a prize for selling the most Girl Scout cookies, said Zero. She was real proud of that. Stanley peeled off another layer of his onion. We always took what we needed, Zero said. When I was little, I didn't even know it was stealing. I don't remember when I found out, but we just took what we needed, never more. So when I saw the shoes on display in the shelter, I just reached in the glass case and I took them. Clyde Livingston's shoes? Asked Stanley. I didn't know they were his. I just thought they were somebody's old shoes. It was better to take someone's old shoes, I thought, than steal a pair of brand new ones. I didn't know they were famous. There was a sign, but of course I couldn't read it. And then the next thing I know, everybody's making this big deal about how the shoes are missing. It was kind of funny in a way. The whole place was just going crazy, and there I was, wearing the shoes. And everyone's running around and saying, "What happened to the shoes? The shoes are gone." And I just walked out the door. No one noticed me. When I got outside, I ran around the corner and I immediately took off the shoes and I put them on top of a parked car. I remember that they smelled really bad. "Yeah, those were them," said Stanley. "Did they fit you?" "Pretty much." Stanley remembered being surprised at Clyde Livingston's small shoe size. Stanley's shoes were bigger. Clyde Livingston had small, quick feet. Stanley's feet were big and slow. "I should have just kept them," said Zero. "I had already made it out of the shelter and everything. I ended up getting arrested the next day when I tried to walk out of a shoe store with a new pair of sneakers. If I had just kept those old smelly sneakers, then neither one of us would be here right now." guys, that's the end of that chapter. We'll pick up again tomorrow. We're getting very close to finishing this book. Have a good afternoon.